Hello, I'm Professor Louise Archer and I work at UCL in the Institute of Education. In this video, I'm going to be discussing a few of the research studies that I've conducted with colleagues over the years on the theme of educational inequalities. You might be familiar with some of these depending which syllabus and which textbooks your school's using, but they all fall within the sociology of education. And the three most commonly cited ones are, first, British Muslim secondary school students' constructions of identity, specifically their constructions of racialised masculinity and femininity. This was the oldest piece of research and was conducted a long time ago in the mid-1990s. It was conducted at a very specific time. It was after the Salman Rushdie affair, but before 9/11. And although dated, I think issues of Islamophobia have sadly very much continued. Second study is research I conducted with Becky Francis on understanding minority ethnic achievement. And this project looked particularly at British Chinese secondary students' educational success. The third project is urban youth and schooling. This was a longitudinal study focusing on young people between the age of 14 and 16 who'd been identified by their schools as being at risk of dropping out of education. So this study looked at how interactions of gender, social class, ethnicity and education shaped young people's educational experiences. We also looked at the role of youth identities and performances of style and appearance and how these impacted on young people's educational experiences, as exemplified by the title of our paper, "University's Not For Me, I'm a Nike Person." In terms of theory, I like to use a mixture of theories in my work, and in the three studies I just mentioned, the most commonly used ones were firstly feminist post-structuralist theorisations of identity, but particularly Judith Butler's work on gender as performed. So the idea that gender isn't just the result of having a particularly sexed body as a body that's seen as male or female, but rather gender is a performance, something that's made and remade. So it's not essentialised, it's not from the body. And these ideas can be extended to social class and race and ethnicity as well. So we understand social identities from this perspective as being socially constructed. Of course, this idea of being socially constructed and performed doesn't mean that they don't have real consequences. And this approach can help highlight how young people can be positioned in particular ways on the basis of gender, race or class, for instance, and the impact that pathologising representations can have for them. I've used analysis of discourse as an analytic tool to help identify the ways in which young people socially construct identities of gender, race and class, and how these get embodied, so shown in the body, and performed. The other theorist whose work I use a lot is Pierre Bourdieu. I find that his core concepts of habitus, capital and field provide a really useful way to foreground the role of structural inequalities. His work is also really good at explaining why unjust relations, so privilege and subordination, keep getting reproduced and why it's so hard to achieve social change. Bourdieu's work also helped explain the role of schools, universities, the education system as a whole, and how these help reproduce unequal social relations, but particularly Bourdieu focuses on unjust social class relations. So for me, Bourdieu does have a lot of really useful ideas, even if he is, as we come across, rather partial to jargon. He does have an absolutely huge back catalogue of papers and books, and for me, I think of his work a bit like a box of chocolates, but very specifically, a variety of boxes of chocolates, something like Quality Street, where there are some really good ones. So for me, the purple Quality Street or the green triangle, those are the ones I like. There's some bits of Bourdieu's work I really like, but there are also ones that I'm really not a big fan of. So for me, in Quality Street, it'd be like the Golden Penny or the coffee one. And for me, in Bourdieu's work, his Golden Penny is his work on gender. I would prefer to pass on that. I think Bourdieu also has very little useful to say about race. He's also not good on accounting for social change. He's very good at explaining why things stay the same, but he's not good at talking about why social change happens, when we get moments of transformation. So let's just say, if we extend our chocolate metaphor, he is no Lindor, he is Quality Street. For me, the Lindor of academic theory is really critical Black feminist work on intersectionality. So this work tells us how it's not useful to try and separate race from gender, from class. This work I think is really important and useful, and it's had much more to say beyond this, and it would be great to see it featured more prominently in things like the A-level syllabus. Talking about methods, I like to use mixed methods in most of my research, although the 3 studies that are included on the A-level curriculum are interestingly all qualitative study. The 3 studies I mentioned use a range of qualitative methods, including discussion groups, photo diaries, interviews. But over the last 10 years, the work I've been doing has used a lot of other qualitative methods like observation, creative methods, photos, portfolio work, artwork, surveys, alongside discussion groups and interviews. Generally, I really like the richness and how you can get the combination of breadth and depth by combining different methods. So I prefer not to just use one, but to use several. Qualitative methods I think are really useful and important for engaging with and capturing people's lived experiences, but I do like to use them in combination. So key things we found in our research. I'd say something that all 3 of the studies have in common is that they were trying to counter deficit discourses about the young people in question. So they were trying to get at the young people's counter-narrative, their counter-articulations of themselves and their experiences. So to understand these and to give these space and bring them to prominence alongside more dominant, often oppressive ideas about them. So in the case of the Muslim pupil study, it was trying to offset the predominant racist and Islamophobic discourses about Muslim young people that were circulating to position them, for example, as threats to society, or which position Muslim girls as being oppressed by their culture. It was also trying to counter ideas but with urban young people, the idea that those who drop out of education are somehow to blame for their disadvantaged positions in society. So instead, the studies were all trying to understand the complexity of the young people's lived experiences, but particularly is trying to understand the views and experiences of these young people who often get positioned as educational problems. So really the studies are about trying to counter and resist this, and to highlight the role of structural inequalities in shaping young people's experiences and life chances, while foregrounding the young people's agency and their creative responses and resistances to these. So one of the things we found in the Muslim Pupils Project was that the young men's performances of race and religion were as much performances of masculinity as they were about race and religion, and that these performances were highly contextualised. So by this I mean that they varied depending on who the researchers were and also what school they were in. So for instance, one of the schools we went to, we felt as researchers had more racism circulating. We felt there was a more uncomfortable tension in terms of race in that school, and that some of the things teachers may said to us or the way they behaved with us felt like there was undercurrents of racism there. For example, when they talked with my friend Tamar, who's a British woman of Pakistani heritage. In that school, the young men who talked with Tamar voiced the strongest and the most challenging views, also the most sexist in what they said. However, the group who spoke with me and the groups from other schools where we didn't notice such strong themes of racism were very different. So we interpreted the young men's performances as telling us about lots of things at the same time. They told us something about the school relations. So we could tell from what they were saying that being in a school where there felt like there was more racist tension made a difference. It also told us about the role of the researcher. So when they talked to me, the power of what the notion of my whiteness being silencing came up. So who you talk to as a researcher is important. and also the ways in which particular researchers, particular schools, particular contexts meant that particular performances of masculinity came out. We also noticed how the boys in that study would describe Muslim girls in ways that were very different to how the Muslim girls constructed their own identities and options, again, which we linked to performances of masculinity rather than being anything inherent to do with Muslim identity. In a sense, sometimes we felt the boys were trying to position themselves as cool boys or as powerful young men in relation to the researcher as a woman, and were saying sexist things about the girls, which the girls said were just not true about their own experiences. The study with Becky Francis on Chinese students, we found that British Chinese students face racism despite their educational success. There were some assumptions by some teachers that somehow, because British Chinese students achieve well, they must be immune or not experience racism. I actually argued that some of the teacher stereotypes we heard about British Chinese students might appear positive, but they were actually pernicious and highly problematic and racist. So some teachers talk to us about Chinese students, they'd say things like, well, they work so hard. And we termed these negative positives. They may appear positive on the surface, but they're actually quite negative. So these ideas went along with descriptions of British Chinese students as being like educational robots who, to quote, would work until you told them to stop, and as too passive or repressed, all of which can be interpreted as dehumanising and homogenising. So when we talk about groups in ways that homogenise, so treat them as all the same, this is highly problematic. In this work, we also identified how dominant, oppressive educational discourse isn't just organised through a binary, a dichotomy between, for example, black and white, and good and bad. We actually suggested that dominant discourse is organised through what we call a trichotomy. So we identified 3 ways in which differences set up through race, class and gender, which all combine together to produce this 3-way split. So what we have, if you think of it as columns, is on one side we have dominant discourse constructing the idealised student, the ideal student, and that student keeps getting constructed in ways that are aligned with whiteness, masculinity and middle classness. And against that ideal, dominant discourse disparages other students by splitting them into 2 types of groups. So we have pathologised students who are, for example, the high achieving British Chinese that we just talked about, some high achieving girls and Indian students. And they're pathologised in particular ways. So they're not positioned as problems as such, but they're seen as being too passive. They're still discussed as learning in the wrong way. And then at the other side, we also have the demonised students who tend to be constructed as black and white working class students, both girls and boys. What we were trying to unpick in that work is the slippery and tricky ways that dominant racist, sexist, classist talk and ideas organise to split and divide students in ways that mean that the ideal student is always naturally seen as white, male and middle class. So it's the ways that racism, sexism, classisms work in practice. So what are we working on currently? It feels quite a long time since the 3 studies I've talked about were done. And it's a shame in many ways that the sociology A-level curriculum does tend to focus on the older research rather than what's happening now, not just my own, but in general. So my research still focuses on educational identities and inequalities. Over the last decade, I've been looking in particular at how this plays out in specific subject areas, notably in the area of science. This is because science is really elitist and these issues show up really clearly, and there's lots of things that science does to exclude people. One of my main pieces of current research is a longitudinal study called the Aspire study, which has been going for 13 years. And in it, we've tracked the same cohort of young people from the age of 10, and we're tracking them up to the age of 23. So through mixed methods, through interviews and large-scale surveys. And the young people are now, at the moment, aged 20, 21. And just this summer, we've completed the most recent set of interviews with them. And we did these during lockdown, which was interesting, different for us. So we conducted the interviews virtually, but we have known the young people since they were 10, so it was easier to get in touch with them. Many of them are in or finishing university. Others are now employed or training, and some have even had children. And the SPIRE study is, for us, a really nice study, getting this breadth, this length of time to understand young people's lives and trajectories. And we're trying to understand what shapes their subject choices, their life choices, and the paths they take, and what's the role of social inequalities in this. So how do we all end up going down these different routes? What can we understand from those patterns and the inequalities shaping them? Within that, we're particularly looking at what are the things that make a difference to who does or doesn't go into areas of science, technology, engineering and maths, STEM areas. But the project is also much broader than that. So currently we're about to bring out a publication talking about the impact of the COVID lockdown on this generation of young people. So often they're referred to now as Generation Z. Yeah, so we're looking at all the things that have impacted their lives, positive and negative, about the lockdown. We're also looking at things like the role of social media and mental health in their lives, things which are really important. I still use feminist, post-structuralist and Bourdieusian conceptual frameworks, and also I've become increasingly interested in how we use critical Black feminist work on the radical potential of ideas like hope and love in education. So moving on from the pessimism of Bourdieu, still using Bourdieu, but also saying, you know, how do we think about possibilities for difference, for making a difference, for changing things? I've also, in my work over the last decade, focused a lot more on what we call praxis, which is the integration, rather than the separation, of theory, research and practice in trying to make a difference. So basically, the extent to which research can be tied to social action and social change. Paulo Freire describes praxis as reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. So I'm interested in how our research can be used to make a difference. Although we love writing books and papers and things, we also want to change things in policy and practice. We don't want it to just sit on a shelf and be read by very few people. So as part of this, we've been developing more participatory ways of working. So working with teachers, out of school educators, policymakers, and importantly, young people, because a lot of our research is about young people, and we want to conduct our research with young people, not on them. So it's not just a case that we do research on people, find out stuff, write it up and tell others about it. Rather, we want to work more collaboratively with the people who are involved in the research to develop it and to formulate it. So we have young people working with us as co-researchers on some of our projects. We've also got young people on our advisory groups and part of our project working groups. So, for example, on one of our projects, we have regular workshops which bring together the researchers with our educational practitioners, so people who work in science centres, zoos, STEM clubs and so on. And we also have young people who are there as our advisors as well, who feed in, share their ideas and help us develop our analyses and our findings. We found this as a really nice way of doing research. We personally, as researchers, have learned a lot from it, and it's also helped our research to make more of an impact. For example, work we've done with teachers has helped lead to changes in educational policy and practice in this country and internationally. And importantly, we felt it's helped support teachers and other practitioners to be more equitable and socially just in their work, which for us is really the point of doing this sort of research. It's to try and help make some sort of difference. So how have things changed and how is this research area still relevant? I would say, unfortunately, there's still as much need today for research on social injustices as there was when I first started my research career. Although I think right now we're in an interesting moment. With thanks to things like the Black Lives Matter movement, the environmental justice movement, decolonise the curriculum movements, all of these I think have been really important and useful. They've also been driven strongly by young people. And they've really helped generate that public understanding and appetite for engaging with issues of injustice, particularly, for example, around the idea of we need to address white privilege. And I've not really seen this mood or this moment, this appetite in public life before. So in many ways, this feels quite like a hopeful potential moment for change. So I'm going to put on a Bourdieu hat. Bourdieu is famously pessimistic about things changing. My concern would be that dominant society, the privileged elite, will always find ways to change up and try and shut down moments of resistance and transgression. If I was to put on a more hopeful Paolo Freire hat, I think that there are some useful possibilities for change. And as a society, we're still talking, for example, we could try and change the scope for changing the way we frame debates around educational inequalities and injustices. So we'll see a lot of talk about, at the moment, about educational gaps. You might have noticed this particularly in terms of the government or your schools or colleges talking about educational gaps widening during the COVID pandemic and the lockdown. But I think if we look to the critical feminist work of people like Gloria Ladson-Billings, it offers us a really valuable and important way to help reframe these discussions. And she argues that rather than talking about educational gaps, for example, between black and white or rich and poor young people, we should be talking about the educational debt that is owed to black students, to poor students, and so on. The importance of this is that it really reframes whose responsibility it is where the problem lies. So rather than seeing the gap as the result of people being lacking or deficit in some way, it says the debt is owed by privileged society. We have created the injustices and the problems, and that debt is owed, so it's incumbent on us to try and address it and repay it. If I was going to highlight something that you might miss if you only read a simple summary of our research, I think the key thing in my view that simple summaries miss about our work is the young people's voices and the richness of what they say and their experiences. So I do use a lot of quotes in my work, and I think the quotes are the best bits, but they often get left out of the summaries. The young people saying things in their own words is always much more powerful and arresting than anything that I write. So I think the summaries really miss what sits at the core of our work. I could also take issue, if you have the Harold Lambos book, with a slightly strange evaluation of some of my work in his book, which I think misses the whole point of a paper that I wrote on the role of the researcher, but that would just be snarky, so I won't mention that. And instead, I'll just say, thanks for listening. I hope this is helpful, and good luck with your sociology A-level.